This is Writer to Writer, and today we're with Connie May Fowler of St. Augustine, and she is one of the rarities in the world, a native Floridian, unlike a transplant such as yourself. She's also the author of Sugar Cage and River of Hidden Dreams. She has been called kind of a modern-day version of Marjorie Kinnan Rollins and Zora Neale Hurston, and is making quite an impression in writing about Florida. And today we'd like to talk about a common problem to people in general, particularly to writers though, and that is how do we face the obstacles of life, cope with those, and yet come to deal with it as material. Not to get too involved in psychobabble, but we can have situations and we're told we're not supposed to talk about something, we're not supposed to feel, to think, we wind up feeling guilty about things, we get isolated, we don't know what's normal. So what does the writer do? What was your first roadblock, let's say?
Well, my first roadblock, I guess I would say, is life.
Life, okay.
Life was the roadblock, but writing was the salvation and the way past that. So I never had a roadblock in terms of, oh, I can't think of anything to write. It was always what saved me. And I mean from my earliest memories, from before I could read, when I would make my sister sit on the bed and read constantly to me, to the point that I had all the Cat in the Hat books memorized and would read along with her, to when I could read myself and started out writing very simple verse and eventually into novels. And so I just took the chaos and turmoil of my life, and writing helped me make sense of it and helped me survive it.
Okay. With the when did you develop the sense of your wanting to tell your own stories?
I don't know that I was conscious of it, but that's what I was doing from my earliest moments.
And your sister was one of the primary ones in your family telling stories. You also mentioned at one time that your grandmother had a tremendous influence.
Yes, my grandmother was Native American. She was a Cherokee Indian, and she was a woman who tried to hide that heritage for lots of different reasons. One, she thought she would survive better. Two, she didn't want to be taken to a reservation out west, and so she just hid that from people, although she looked Native American, so she couldn't really hide it. She thought she was doing a good job with her white makeup and red rouge, and but she didn't fool too many people. But she didn't instill in anyone any Native American heritage within the family, except every once in a while she would decide to tell the truth. And when she told the truth, it was in the stories she told. She'd sit down on her front porch and begin to tell us stories about what her life was like when she still accepted her Indian identity. So our heritage was passed down through stories.
And you've since used that in River of Hidden Dreams.
Yes.
And in the New York Times book review section, you had a very interesting piece in about how you came to, first of all, plunge into that whole story, the problems that you had just getting past the wall of silence that had existed regarding certain specific details.
Well, a lot of people, I can't tell you how many people going on tour would say to me, you know, I had a similar situation in my background and my family's just beginning to talk about it. Today, that's hard to believe because Native American heritage is something that we think people are proud to be, but that's a very recent phenomenon. And so a lot of people are just now beginning to tell the truth to their sons and daughters and grandchildren. But for me, the story's always haunted me. She died when I was quite young, and I wanted to know why she gave up her heritage and more about what that life was like for her. And so also, as I grew older, I decided that maybe the stories weren't exactly true and I shouldn't put much stock into them, and so I decided to search out official histories. And of course, the official histories, most of them turned to dust. And those that I did find, a lot of them were just composed of half-truths or out-and-out lies, or no information at all. A lot of the documents were filled in with dashes. So what I had to do in creating the story and trying to understand my grandmother was I had to believe in her stories again. I had to believe in her as a storyteller and come to realize that that's where the truth resides.
In St. Augustine, St. Augustine has a particular history regarding the Indians. Could you bring up a little bit about that?
Part of the research I did for the novel, and River of Hidden Dreams comes from two inspirational sources. One was my grandmother's life, and the other was the Native incarceration in 1875 of Plains Indians. And I was at the fort one day playing tourist, and I've come from Northeast Florida, but I had never known about the Native American incarcerations there, which happened, I think, on 3 different occasions. But they had a display up this time about the 1875 situation, and they had a photograph, and it was all men except for one woman and a tiny little girl. And I thought, what in the world was that little girl doing being incarcerated in the fort? And my fanciful imagination jumps to, maybe that's my grandmother. And of course it wasn't, but I researched the little girl's life to discover why she was in the fort. And so those 2 branches came together to be the backdrop for River of Hidden Dreams.
Okay. People were thinking that they were doing the Indians a favor by wiping out their heritage and bringing them to the West.
They were basically brainwashed while in the fort. I mean, it was just constant assault on their heritage and on their self-esteem, which Sparrow Hunter, the character in the book, undergoes that, and she so thoroughly buys it that what she becomes indelibly imprinted with is a kind of self-hatred that is incredibly self-destructive. And her journey is to come to terms with who she is and to love herself again. But it was a very systematic washing away of their identity, and they weren't even allowed to speak their native tongues. That was a violation that they could be executed for.
Right. So many of those incidences, I've noticed parallel what occurred to the Irish and what occurred to the Scots. And I've been researching the Cherokees and the Creeks, sometimes the Choctaws, and found that there's just a tremendous similarity in all this sort of facing civilization. And yet if they were adopting it, frequently they didn't prosper anyway because they still had property.
They were still the oppressed.
Still
no
the oppressed.
What.
If they wrote a constitution like Sequoia, had a newspaper like that, it got closed down.
That's
So
right.
it seemed like they could not win in that particular aspect there. Now, how did you get into the pain of your grandmother? Because that's a certain stage there to understand what the person is going through, and then creating a character from that. At what point did you realize you were becoming one?
Well, that's an interesting stage in a novel. At some point, I mean, you go in with the frontal lobe of your brain where everything is conscious and you think you're in control, and that's not the ideal place to be. What you want to happen in the writing of a novel is that your unconscious takes over, and it's almost as if writers need to have a very thin membrane where they easily fuse with that character. You know, my grandmother became a character, but I became the character. Right. So that in some sort of creative and almost metaphysical way, you are that character, right. Very easily able to slip into their skin.
Okay. When you were facing that problem there of moving characters around, maybe like chess pieces, did you find that you have some villains that you have to love?
Absolutely. That was particularly in the case with Sugar Cage, with the character Charlie Looney.
Right.
He's a very complex person, but I didn't want him to be a one-dimensional villain. They're not interesting, and I don't think they're believable. And also, there had to be a reason why Rose Looney stuck by him and loved him. There had to be some kind of charm about this man. And some reason why people really did like him despite his horrific politics and other things that weren't so good about him. But I think that those sorts of people are much more interesting, but that's a real struggle when there's a character that you just really have a problem with their attitudes, with their politics, with their actions, but to write them honestly and truthfully, you need to somehow find something about them to like.
Charles Lawton was describing playing villains on movie theaters and in movies and on the stage there, and he was stroking of the cat, some little gestures to make you identify with them and see the softer side of them. In Sugar Cage, you use several voices in there and go into it quite convincingly. I counted them, there were 9 different voices, about 6 of them used majorly Charlie, the husband who played around and drank around, etc., the wife who was long-suffering and wore her suffering on her sleeve until towards the very end, and of course the son fighting the turmoil of his life there. There was a tremendous amount of poverty that was worked into there, and would you comment on that and how you were able to get that sense of realism?
Well, I grew up extremely poor, and my books so far, I don't know that who knows what will happen 10 years from now, 30 years from now, but so far my books have been very, very close to the bone. And so the realism that you pick up on is from my life experience. I know that it's common to say now that writers shouldn't write from their experience, that they just produce this self-absorbed drivel. Well, that's just absolutely ridiculous. We'd have to throw out almost all of literature if we were going to say writers couldn't write from their experience. But I don't write about privileged people or even necessarily middle-class people because it's an experience that I don't know about.
If I did not know more facts about you than I do know, since you've spoken at the Writers Festival and been around the area a lot, I might look at you and say, here's someone from obviously a privileged class here, a silver spoon in her mouth, and does not know what life is really like there. So you contradict that very much with your life experiences when you're writing on that.
Well, part of that is that my mother, I mean, we grew up on public assistance, and we were living on, like, at one point, maybe $125 a month. You know, it was very, very rough. But she was a woman who, for both good and bad reasons, wanted us to keep up appearances. It's a very Southern thing, I think.
Respectability.
And so a lot of people had no idea about the circumstances we were living in. A lot of people had no idea that we were living in a seedy slum row motel room for many, many years, or that she had a very severe drinking problem. All of that was hidden. And so in a way, I'm very practiced at illusion, which I think helps in my writing.
Right. So many writers seem to be your basic adult child of alcoholics. And
Yes.
they said that's the occupational disease. I don't know if it is or not, but probably it's the occupational disease in every occupation out there. But when you were talking about dealing with the events, and people say not writing from experience, could they be talking about obtaining the proper distance from the material being used, the events being used?
I think they're talking about a couple of things, and the distance is needed. For instance, and I think a lot of writers share this, I can't write about recent events really well. I need the distance of time to gain the objectivity, to help me mold and get a better focus and a more full, well-rounded focus on it. But also, part of the time distancing that is so important is that it helps you collapse time, because that's what a novel is. You're playing with time. And so that, for instance, my book in progress is very, very closely based on my childhood, and it's based upon a character very close to my mother. But I couldn't write it exactly as is, because one, it would have been, like 2,000 pages and just, really boring and obese. And so what I did was I realized, oh yeah, this is fiction, and I can collapse time. I can turn it into this mythic world that becomes understandable, that you can deal with within the scope of a 200, 300-page book. And so that's the objectivity that's needed. You're not objective in terms of you have to feel those gut-wrenching experiences all over again. The pain and the heartache and the anger, all those things have to live on that page, but you're objective in the sense that you know how to collapse time to make all those events understandable to readers.
Right. There's also, when people are distancing, they will either be sentimental, which is not really dealing with it at all, just coming up with the images of the puppy dogs and the smiling children, or the tears rolling down the face, or they're disillusioned, they're cynical, they're the private eye walking the mean streets. So it's a very tricky.
The best writers are people who are incredibly honest. I mean, honest to the point that it hurts them. It hurts their hearts to be that honest, but that's what you have to be.
Yeah, because that's what you bring that's different from what another writer might bring there. The British, Trinidad and British writer, his folks were from India. V.S. Naipaul once said that an autobiography can distort, facts can be realigned, but fiction never lies. It reveals the writer totally.
That's true.
And that seems to be so much right on target there, that even if we live our fictions in our own lives there too.
Well, that's the paradox of fiction. It's almost always truer than nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. Which are the most influential works that you've read that have meant the most to you?
God, in my lifetime so far, that's so hard to say because I always feel like I'm leaving out books, but I can say that I have always read and continue to read a lot of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And I began as a poet, and I think that a lot of fiction writers cut their teeth, so to speak, writing poetry first, and some continue to do it because it gives you that incredible awareness of language.
Right.
And I think that you can tell a writer who's interested in poetry versus one who's not, because there's just a difference in the attention to detail on the page. I also have spent an awful lot of time reading dramatists.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know exactly what attracts me to them, but I suppose part of it is the dialogue, and it's one of the best places in the world to learn dialogue.
Right. With playwrights particularly, I hear them talk about an adage of put the suffering on the stage, and instead of having characters maybe telling what happened off the stage, maybe as the Greeks might do. Although the Greeks had a lot of suffering out there, as we see Oedipus going through the turmoil of his discoveries in his own life there. How do you set scenes and come up with the images that you deal with when you're doing Sugar Cage, River of Hidden Dreams, and the work you're dealing with now?
It's very organic. I know some writers start out with a plan and they say they don't deviate from it, and I'm not sure that I believe them. Because writing, I think, for most people is so organic, and it takes on a life of its own. And all of these things, this metaphorical language, almost a hidden language, starts coming through in the creative process. And at some point, you do start becoming aware of it and say, oh, that's really good. That's my metaphor structure. That's my myth structure. And then you can play with that. But I think I start out pretty slowly and just let it evolve and tell me what to do for the first few months that I'm writing. And I'm usually very slow for the first half of a book, and then the second half flies. I wrote the last half of my work in progress in 2 weeks on 3 legal pads. But the other 6 months had been painstaking laying it all out on the computer.
So you're dealing both with the legal pad and computer there, so you don't just simply rely strictly on one medium.
No, I really like handwriting a first draft.
When you have that first half that you're moving slowly on, I suspect that there's a discovery
Exactly.
of knowing who the people are, having someone there who's flat maybe, and then something.
You know, I think that one of the things that writers need to learn to do is to trust their instincts. And sometimes something's happening on the page and you don't know why it's there. But if you feel strongly about it, you just go with it. And at some point, you'll understand why it's there and make it work. You'll understand what its part is in the scheme of things. But I'm a very instinctual writer. And I think that those are the 2 things that I could recommend to young writers to do is 1, discipline, discipline, discipline.
Right.
And 2 is to trust their instincts.
Trust the instincts. When you are trusting your instincts and you're dealing with something and you're being methodical, doing it every day, and you reach a point and you absolutely hate the section you're dealing with, how do you get off that particular spot?
I just make myself go on, you know, because I know I can I'll go back to it a million times in the future. And so it's not worth my time to sit there and remain stuck in the mire, because what's there might very well be needed. It just might need a lot of work, or something that happens later on will click in my brain, oh, that's what I need to do back there. That's why that person is there.
With Sugar Cage, you were writing essentially on the 1960s, heavily in the 1960s.
Yes, it's the decade of the 60s.
Right. And dealt with the major events that were occurring. We have the death of Kennedy referred to in there, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and bringing together of life there. Did you have to do much research, or was that all pretty much there with you?
Well, that was all from my memory, really. I mean, that is also very much based on my memories from childhood. However, once I had the first or second draft done, I decided I couldn't trust my memory. It's sort of the same experience I had with River. I can't trust my grandmother's stories. I have to go back and find the truth.
Right.
So I went in and did my research after the fact. I'm getting famous for doing research after the fact.
After the fact.
But it proved that out to be so. My memory served me well.
Okay.
And I think that when anyone who grew up in the 60s, I mean, I was quite young in the 60s, but when you grew up, I mean, those were such horrific events, even for a small child. I mean, the world was being blown apart. All of our heroes, we saw them gunned down.
Right. I grew up in the 40s, and that we won the biggest war of the decade, I mean, of the century, a decade of affirmation. The 50s, kind of a blah thing, and then 60s come along, just tremendous.
And for the little girl and for Emery, the boy in Sugar Cage, those national events mirrored the violence that was going on in their private lives and the deaths that they were experiencing in their homes.
Okay. With the, when you finished Sugar Cage, how soon thereafter did you get into the next one, or at what point did River start suggesting itself to you, or had it always been there?
Well, it had always been there. In a way, I think all my books have always been there. But I started thinking about it more sometime while I was writing Sugar Cage. I mean, I definitely had the first draft done, but at some point in the process, I started thinking ahead. And it's the same thing that I'm doing with River. At some point, I knew pretty much what my next book would be. And now, even though I'm not nearly finished with the third book, I'm still thinking about that next one.
Okay. What advice would you give someone who is where you were, the person is about 18, 24, something like that, and they are trying to deal with their life problems, and yet they want to become a writer?
Well, I think that I would have to say just live life.
Okay.
I think that I don't find writing about people who haven't had interesting lives very interesting writing, and that doesn't mean that I'm advocating they go out and live bizarre lives, but I think that they should live life to its fullest, whatever that kind of life that may be. Writers become writers in part because they're like these really sensitive creatures that soak everything in around them. And while that's a very close experience, also to have a core inside themselves that remains a distant observer to help translate what they're seeing.
Back then, early on, you were very much aware of the importance of education, and how would that follow through as something useful both for the writer just in general?
Well, I think, I mean, education for me was a way out of poverty, and it was the only way out of poverty. And I believe that firmly for everyone. You know, you're not going to get out of the terrible circumstances of your life unless you're educated, unless you can write the King's English, so to speak. Without that degree and without that knowledge, you know, there's no way to climb up that ladder. So that's one thing. But also for a writer, I think it's so important to read. I don't know how people think they're going to write if they don't read.
Right.
I had a friend of mine who wanted to be a playwright and a novelist, and he hasn't done either one, but he said, I said, well, what are you reading? He said, oh, I don't want to read. I don't want any of that to influence me. I don't want to brush off on me, which is, of course, absurd. If you don't, it's whatever you do, whatever craft you're in, whatever profession you're in, if you're not actively immersed in the entire scene and what other people are doing, you know, you can't be an astronaut if you don't know how to fly the plane.
Right.
You know?
William Faulkner, when he was a young man, had a good friend in Mississippi who basically just gave him a bunch of books and ordered him, in effect, to read all of these, which you did do.
That's what I did before I wrote Sugar Cage, because it started out as a short story. And I was in graduate school at the time. There was quite a few years between graduate school and undergraduate school, which I think helped me because I came into a graduate program with a lot more life experience and I think better prepared to withstand the rigors of graduate school, which are immense. But my teacher said, there's the seed of the novel here, and you really need to pursue that. And I thought, oh, great. First they made me write a short story, now they're going to make me write a novel. And I had no idea, because that's so daunting. You know, how in the world to do that? The form is so daunting. And so I just read. I sat and I think I holed up for about 2 months and read everything I could get my hands on.
Okay. And your teacher was?
Carolyn Doty, she's a professor at University of Kansas.
Okay. I think everyone out there who's interested in writing at some point has some teacher there that
Yes.
makes you realize that you can become a writer.
That's right.
Not necessarily a Comp 1 teacher or anyone like that, but someone different like that. Okay. Today we've been talking to Connie May Fowler, and Connie May Fowler has written Sugar Cage, River of Hidden Dreams, and is working on another book, obviously. And from St. Augustine, she brings a happy view, I would think. I mean, it's a positive and a view of enrichment of life in Florida and life in the 20th century and in life, I'm sure, in the 21st century. And we look forward to your future triumphs.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Okay. Thank you.